In 1945, the United States and Japan had been facing each other for 4 years in the Pacific War, one of the largest scenarios of World War II. On July 26th of that year, the President of the United States, Harry Truman, issued an ultimatum against the Japanese. He demanded an unconditional surrender, otherwise they would have to face rapid and total destruction. Truman's message did not mention the use of nuclear weapons. However, these devices were part of the arsenal that the United States had in its power, an arsenal they did not hesitate to use. But what happened on the day of the first nuclear attack in the history of mankind? Well, you are going to learn about that today. But before we start, I ask you please to leave your like if you haven't done so yet, subscribe, activate notifications, and I invite you to leave a comment below suggesting possible topics for new videos. Now let's get started. From some small stations, 16 kilometers away from Hiroshima, confusing reports began to arrive about a terrible explosion in the city. Sinister cloud, a terrible flash, a loud rumble. Alerted from Tokyo, they tried to communicate with Hiroshima. It was in vain. Both their radio stations and their military barracks showed no signs of life. What had happened? No time was wasted, and the alarm was relayed to the central headquarters of the Japanese Empire's General Staff who, astonished, confirmed that there was no kind of alert over the city that would suggest the worst. They also knew that there were no explosives stored there, so the idea of an explosion became more and more unlikely by the minute. Some even allowed themselves to think that there was a non-tragic explanation for what was happening. They didn't know they were facing one of the worst scenarios that had occurred on planet Earth. A young staff officer was assigned to fly immediately to Hiroshima land, analyze the damage, and return to Tokyo with first-hand information. After flying for 3 hours, when they were still about 160 kilometers away from the city, he and his pilot spotted a large cloud of smoke. The remains of Hiroshima were on fire. The destruction was of a magnitude that left them stunned. What had happened there? The germ of all this matter had been born in the minds of some scientists. Scientists who went from being the best of their era to being judged by a large part of the world population. The conviction that what Hitler could do with an atomic bomb was even worse, a recalcitrant paranoia, and access to a more than generous budget to carry out research had made the United States the holder of a very particular merit. Of being the first country in history to attack using an atomic bomb and unleashing hell. Working on his own record of the mission, Lewis, co-pilot of the man who was flying the plane that had dropped the bomb, wrote in his diary as he left Hiroshima behind, "My God, what have we done?" In 1922, the Washington Naval Treaty visibly angered the Japanese. And that's because this treaty limited the number of ships they could own, brazenly ensuring the naval supremacy of the American and British fleets. As if that wasn't enough, the European powers occupied territories within what Japan considered its sphere of influence, so in 1937 it made the decision to invade China, a conflict that would last 8 years. In turn, in 1940, Japan signed the Tripartite Pact with Germany and Italy, which aligned Japan with the Axis powers. Without wasting time and with clear intentions of showing their conviction, in July of 1941, Japan invaded with its troops to the south of Indochina, territory controlled by France. The United States considered that this warranted retaliation. Trade embargoes and a 90% reduction in oil supply to the country were some of these measures. Due to these sanctions, as well as those imposed by the British and Dutch, Japan's foreign trade lowered its life pulse to increasingly sporadic beats. But did this make Japan surrender or be intimidated? Well, no. In fact, it did just the opposite. On November 5th, Emperor Hirohito and the Japanese government decided to declare war on the United States if the oil embargo was not lifted by the end of the month. On December 7th, the first Japanese fleet launched a massive air attack against Pearl Harbor. Therefore, the next day, on December 8th, the United States Congress declared war on Japan. But what exactly was the Pearl Harbor incident? Well, if you want to know how Japan attacked this base of the United States in Hawaii, what the consequences were and so on, I invite you to watch the video that is uploaded to this channel called The Day There Was an Attack on Pearl Harbor. There you will see this whole story developed and you will get to know what would be the first part of today's narration. To continue with what concerns us, it is enough for us to know that the attack on Pearl Harbor took place just one day after Roosevelt authorized a secret project known as the Manhattan Engineering District, more commonly known by everyone as the Manhattan Project. In August of 1939, nuclear scientists Leo Slidar, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, Jewish refugees from Hungary, believed that the energy released by nuclear fission could be used for the production of bombs by the Germans, which is why they convinced Albert Einstein to warn President Roosevelt. In this way, with a simple letter, the Manhattan Project was born, the code name for the United States nuclear project, which under the scientific direction of Robert Oppenheimer would end up employing 1,300,000 people and having a final cost of $2 billion. But everything had a single goal, and this goal was to surpass the Nazi nuclear project, known as the Uranium Project, carried out by Ernest Heisenberg, by developing a functional atomic bomb. Was this goal achieved? Well, unfortunately, yes. The first target chosen was Hiroshima. The city had not been bombed before, so it was a good place to notice the effects of the bomb. Additionally, it was the headquarters of a military base. The Little Boy bomb exploded in the air about 600 meters above the ground. The internal mechanism of Little Boy worked like a gun. It fired an uranium-235 piece at another of the same material, 5 against another of the same material. Upon collision, the nuclei of the atoms that made them up split in a process called fission. That fission of the nuclei occurs consecutively, generating a chain reaction in which energy is released and finally an explosion is unleashed. Little Boy carried a load of 64 kilograms of uranium-235, of which it is estimated that only about 1.4% underwent fission. The explosion generated a heat wave of over 4,000 degrees Celsius within a radius of approximately 4.5 kilometers. It is estimated that 50,000 to 100,000 people perished on the day of the explosion. The city suffered devastation across 10 square kilometers. The explosion was felt more than 60 kilometers away. Two-thirds of the city's buildings, about 60,000, were reduced to rubble. The intense heat caused fires that for 3 days devoured an area of 7 kilometers around Ground Zero. The bomb had been dropped by the Enola Gay, a B-29 bomber. With a wingspan of 45 meters and covered in polished aluminum that is almost a mirror, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress Enola Gay is for some a symbol of mass destruction, but for others it is the culmination of a horrific war that could have resulted in 1 million American deaths. It is on display at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Chantilly, Virginia, near Washington, District of Columbia. This huge complex, with several hangars full of aircraft from all eras, shuttles, rockets, and missiles, is further away from the museum that most tourists know, in the center of the American capital. When the 50th anniversary of the bombing of Hiroshima came, there were a series of controversies. For some, the Enola could not be displayed out of respect. Even today, the winged beast still has as many fans as detractors and hovers over the imagination of many, sometimes as a wet dream, sometimes as a nightmare. Paul Warfield Tibbets Jr. was the commander and pilot of the Enola Gay. The name of the bomber was chosen by Pete Tibbets himself, who named it after his mother, Enola Gay Hazard Tibbets. After completing his mission, Tibbets remained in service and had a long life. He wrote his memoirs and received several honors. He never expressed remorse for his role in dropping the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. However, the same did not happen with Claude Hitherley, the pilot who commanded the Straight Flash, the observation plane. His story became very well known. Claude Edel was discharged from the Air Force in 1947. His fall was precipitous. His post-war life was predictable. Arrests for minor offenses, jobs where he lasted very little, some short-term hospitalizations to monitor his mental health. After those days in the hospital, Italy would leave, get a job, and the cycle would repeat itself. The only changes were increased crime severity and longer hospital stays. In the meantime, divorce, children who didn't want to see him anymore, a couple of failed suicide attempts. At that time, his anti-war preaching had begun. In many places around the world, his story was told and his statements were reproduced. He had been part of the horror that weighed on his conscience. And of course, he let the world know. Official voices in the United States and former colleagues from the 509 Operations Corps tried to downplay and undermine his stance. They argued that his mental problems had started before the war. Others spoke of jealousy, of seeking prominence, of bad subsequent decisions that led them to take on the role of the victim. For many, Italy's only mistake was regretting his relatively innocent participation in the brutal massacre. There is ample evidence that his contemporaries were willing to honor him for his participation in the massacre, but when he showed remorse, they lashed out at him, recognizing in this remorse their own condemnation for what he had done to all those people. The Jukin Garden, the oldest in the city, was only 1.7 kilometers from the hypocenter of the explosion. People began to arrive at the garden desperately in search of water. They arrived barefoot, the skin on their backs also hung down, and they dragged it from their heels. The Green Legacy Hiroshima Initiative, or Hiroshima's Green Legacy, seeks to ensure that the city's suffering is not only not forgotten but can be transformed into a source of hope. The project sends seeds from the trees that survived the devastation of the atomic bomb to different countries around the world. These trees are known in Japan as hibaku, or trees that survived the nuclear explosion. There are about 160 surviving trees in Hiroshima. Many were moved and replanted due to construction works, and only about 30 are in the same place they were when the bomb exploded. But it wasn't just trees that survived. The Japanese word hibakusha means survivor of the atomic bombs. Many of those who did not die instantly from the nuclear impact did so months or years later due to various delayed effects of radioactivity in their bodies. According to the Atomic Bomb Survivors Relief Law of 1994, there are three categories of hibakusha: those directly exposed to the nuclear bomb, those who were within the radius of 2 kilometers of its fall during the following 2 weeks to the fact, and the in utero hibakusha, that is, those who descend from the people of the previous categories. The hibakusha in many cases develop diseases as a result of radiation, from asthma to cancerous tumors. The stigma of having been victims lasted for many years in Japan and the world, and there are survivors who claim to feel it even today. Under the fear that the effects of radiation could be contagious, it was very difficult for them to find employment, get married, return to having something like a normal life. The hibakusha were followed for decades by American scientists without receiving medical treatment, in order not to interfere with the actual effects of radiation. Over time, however, the research focus changed and the studies led to significant medical advances related to the link between radiation and conditions such as cancer. They were also useful in determining the radioactive limit that a human being can withstand for medical purposes. The contribution of the hibakusha to science has been enormous. The Hibakusha Stories organization recognizes Sadako Sasaki as the most famous hibakusha in history. Sasaki was 2 when the nuclear attack hit Hiroshima. Although she survived, at 12 years old she contracted leukemia, a disease that was growing among survivors at that time. Hospitalized for months in the Japanese Red Cross hospital, it is said that Sasaki shared a room with a young woman who told her about the traditional legend of the 1,000 origami cranes. According to her, anyone who made 1,000 origami cranes could make a wish that would come true. There are varying accounts of the number of cranes Sasaki folded. In some cases, she doesn't reach 1,000, and in others, she far exceeds the number. In October, months after being diagnosed, she died. Sasaki was buried with 1,000 origami cranes made by her classmates. Sasaki is today an icon of the Hibakusha struggle and popularized, of course, the legend of the thousand cranes as a symbol of this fight for life in Hiroshima, that as hard as it may be for many to believe, today is a habitable place. How is it possible that Hiroshima, which suffered such devastating nuclear explosions and enormous loss of life, is now a thriving and inhabited city, while Chernobyl is an uninhabited place and will remain so perhaps for thousands of years? Well, that's something many people wonder about, and it has an answer. The little boy bomb carried 63 kilograms of enriched uranium. Chernobyl's number 4 reactor had about 180 tons of nuclear fuel, of which 2% was pure uranium. When the reactor exploded, it is estimated that 7 tons of nuclear fuel were released. In total, the disaster emitted 100 times more radiation than the bombs that fell on Nagasaki and Hiroshima. In the Hiroshima bomb, only about 0.90 kilograms of uranium reacted. In Chernobyl, however, about 7 tons of nuclear fuel with huge amounts of radioactive particles escaped into the atmosphere. When the nuclear fuel melted, radioactive isotopes were released that included xenon, radioactive iodine, and cesium. The 2 bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were detonated in the air, hundreds of meters above the Earth's surface. As a result, the radioactive deposits were scattered by the cloud created by the explosion. In Chernobyl, however, when reactor number 4 melted on the surface, a neutron activation occurred that caused the Earth to become radioactive. Although they operate on the basis of the same principles, the detonation of an atomic bomb and the collapse of a nuclear plant are very different processes. The initial radiation from a nuclear accident can be much lower than that of a bomb, but its lifespan is much longer. It is estimated that it will take thousands of years, 20,000 have been mentioned, for the Chernobyl exclusion zone to become habitable again. Meanwhile, in Hiroshima, the streets are filled daily with people who maintain a very strong memory of the incident while going about their routine. People go to work, children study. This is a city like any other. A city with a very tragic past and a very divided vision. For example, regarding Einstein, but before addressing Einstein's story, I want to remind you that if you want to deeply understand what happened in Chernobyl, I invite you to watch The Day There Was an Explosion in Chernobyl, which is a video that is uploaded to this channel, of course, where we develop that topic, telling absolutely all the chronology and details. In July of 1946, Time magazine published on a cover an illustration of Einstein's face, and in the background the mushroom-shaped cloud that the explosions produced. In the middle of the smoke it reads E equals mc squared. The article says that theoretically Einstein was the father of this atomic bomb because thanks to his famous equation it made it possible to manufacture this nuclear weapon. For some though, the link is less apparent. E equals mc squared explains where the energy comes from, but it doesn't say how to make an atomic bomb. In other words, the famous equation can help understand why atomic bombs work, but it doesn't specifically say how they work. Einstein's other association with the atomic bomb was the letter he sent to President Roosevelt in 1939, 6 years before the bombings. The letter recommended maintaining permanent contact between the government and the physicists researching nuclear issues in the United States, securing uranium supplies, allocating funds for experimental work, and seeking the cooperation of industrial laboratories. The letter at no point suggests the manufacture of an atomic bomb, however. Some experts consider it crucial. The letter changed the course of history by driving the participation of the US government in nuclear research. Regardless, the scientist declared a few months before dying in 1955 that what happened in Hiroshima was due to his error. To a big mistake of his. The smartest man in the world was also the most regretful man in the world. Many consider that the relatively quick Japanese surrender validates Truman's decision to resort to nuclear weapons. By that time, the bombings by the American Air Force had already caused more deaths than the nuclear devices would eventually cause. Others, however, consider the use of weapons or strategies that do not discriminate between combatants or civilians to be unjustifiable. Under this stance, Hiroshima was, without a doubt, a war crime. The truth is that the appearance of atomic bombs completely changed the historical structure of international confrontations. In 1970, the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons emerged, to which all countries except India, Pakistan and North Korea, which possess nuclear weapons, and Israel, which is believed to possess them but has never acknowledged it, are now adhered. The Hiroshima Peace Museum was founded as a commemoration site in the Peace Park in 1955 after the atomic bombing. The main building was planned by the architect Ken Sotange. The museum's foundation gathers objects that recall the incidents and narratives of the victims' experiences and participates in the international peace movement. The museum not only details the catastrophe of August 6th, but also displays information about atomic weapons in the world. Compared to another Japanese museum, the Peace Museum shows a different view of Japanese history and makes a critique of Japanese militarism. A group of researchers who worked on the Manhattan Project created a bulletin of atomic scientists to warn about the dangers of nuclear energy and weapons of mass destruction. In 1947, they implemented the concept of the doomsday clock to emphasize the urgency of the matter. It's an idea that says humanity is minutes away from midnight, where midnight means a very simple thing, the total destruction of all living things. The doomsday clock was moved forward in January of 2020, leaving only about 100 seconds to midnight. Without a doubt, the experience of Hiroshima put us in a race against this clock. Can the human being possibly save himself from this voracious instinct for self-destruction? Or will we all end up flying through the air at the least expected moment? That's it for today's video. I hope you found it interesting. I invite you to leave recommendations for possible videos on this channel, and I also invite you to browse this channel because I'm sure you will find a lot of videos that you haven't seen yet and you will find them very interesting. Without anything else to say, I say goodbye. My name is Magnum Mephisto and this was The Day.